It's like one of those one-eyed monsters. What are those things? Cyclops in mythology. A cyclops thinks one thing. A cyclops is like a giant penis, by the way. I mean, from a symbolic perspective, it's the same idea because it's usually something masculine and single-minded. Okay, so, and the idea is that that masculine, single-minded thing is a personality that's dominated by a single motivational state. And that makes it extremely powerful and giant-like, but also kind of blind and lumbering, right? Because it only wants one thing. That little monster that you grew inside your head, which is one of these cyclops, it's going to pop up and shut the rest of you down. And so that's not so good. And so the addiction isn't a behavior that's manifested in response to a cue, and it's not craving. It's the manifestation of a full-fledged, one-dimensional personality with its own perceptions, emotions, motivations, and cognitions that wants one thing and does not care about anything else. Well, maybe it also cares about the other things that you think to hell with, because, you know, that's in the associated cognitive web. So that's what grows. But addicting is complicated. Addicting means that it grows an addicted personality in your head. That's why it's so hard to get unaddicted. It's not just a matter of getting rid of the craving. That's nothing. You can put someone in a cell for 3 days and they won't be going through withdrawal anymore. They won't crave as long as they're there. You're opening yourself up fundamentally to something like possession by a Dionysius. Of course, you like that because Dionysius is a very short-term, pleasure-seeking, sort of lustful type of sub-personality, and you got to repress that most of the time because, you know, it's not very sightly. But if you drink enough wine, whoa, you know, fun. You can do all the stupid things that really give you a dopamine kick but aren't so good for you in the long run. So, and it's best to think about that as a personality. So, here's something interesting you may or may not know. Medieval people, when they talked about the 7 deadly sins, so that's 7 deadly ways to miss the target, right? They personified each of the sins, which I love because it's so sophisticated. It's far more sophisticated than the way we conceptualize mental disease, because we think of the brain as a subset of something like robotic cognitive circuits. It's like, no, wrong. You're a collection of personalities, sub-personalities, loosely ruled by you. But all those sub-personalities, those are bloody powerful forces. And they're not just cognitive circuits. They have their own viewpoint. And I really mean that. Like, they see the world a particular way, which is the way you see the world when you want to have sex, or when you're hungry, or when you're thirsty, or when you're angry, or when you want revenge, or whatever. Those are real things, and they're not little circuits. They're alive, and you can make them grow and dominate. So this is pride. Pride is the thing that makes you think you know everything. And it's associated with a descent into hell. That's good. That makes a lot of sense. When I get to the bottom of my clinical client's pathology, and this is for people who are really suffering, there's usually, the things that I find at the bottom are usually one of two or both. One is pride. The people, especially the people who have something like personality disorder, they bloody well think that they can get away with tricks and that no one is smart enough to figure it out. And if they don't think that, a family member thinks it. And so it's appallingly arrogant. Appallingly. Another thing that's often at the bottom is resentment, which is this notion that life is terrible, you know, generally speaking, but it's terrible for me in a specific way in that I've been picked out for a particular form of unjust misery. And that allows me to be righteous in my anger and to torture people half to death. You get a good combination of resentment and arrogance going. You can be sure that you'll end up in something that is pretty much indistinguishable from hell, and also that feels like it lasts for an eternity. Yeah. And then there's avarice. Well, 2008 pretty much, you know, is our lesson for that. That's narrowing of the value structure to a specific kind of greed-like pursuit, right? And why is it wrong? Well, it's because you sacrifice everything else of value to it. And you lose the balance, and then you lose the equilibrated state. Not good. Lust, that's a lovely drawing. I like it a lot because it kind of indicates this sort of animal-like nature, which of course is what you'd expect for sexual arousal, right? It's an massively archaic biological force. And it's transpersonal too because, you know, you all partake in it, but it's superordinate to everyone, of course. So, envy, sloth, gluttony, all with their own associated devil. Lovely symbolic representations, dreamlike representations, really. And if you do analysis of people's dreams, when they're suffering from one form or another, you often find representations in the dreams that are, vaguely reminiscent of sometimes not so vaguely either. I had a psychotic client once who had been doing immunological research at McGill, and he was under a lot of pressure because his older brother was a doctor, another one was a lawyer, a lot of second-generation immigrant, ambition pressure in his family. He couldn't get his master's degree to work properly, so he faked it out and handed in the thesis, and that night he woke up and saw the devil sitting at the foot of his bed, and that was when he disintegrated into a psychotic state. Now, you can explain that biologically, no problem, I think, because, it sounds kind of like a little bit of an epileptic episode induced by stress or something like that. But the phenomenology is part of the experience, too. And those things are a lot more common than you'd think. There's anger. That's resentment, most specifically. See, and this is Satan right here, thrown out of heaven. And he's trapped in ice, which I really like because he's immobile and cold. So he can't move. And the reason he can't move is because he's plotting revenge, essentially. And to see someone in a state like that really is awful. This is from Shakespeare. You might think about it as the credo of personality that's trapped by vengeful anger. Why should wrath be mute and fury dumb? I am no baby. I, that with base prayers I should repent the evils I have done. 10,000 worse that ever yet I did would I perform if I might have my will. If one good deed in all my life I did, I do repent it from my very soul. Yeah, well, you don't hear psychiatric diagnosis of that sort very often. But you see it a lot more often than you'd think, because I see in my clients certainly suicidal impulses that are destructive beyond belief, but also equally frequently homicidal impulses, and generated for all sorts of reasons. Ugly situations. More on conception of mental health. Let's see here. What have I got for time? I want to talk a little bit about self-deception. All right, so let's talk about mental health. One of the things that I've noticed also about psychiatric and psychological diagnosis, this isn't so true when you think about work mostly done in the 1950s by the existentialist psychotherapists. And this was sort of in the aftermath of World War II, when people were particularly concerned with moral choice. The existentialists were very interested in authenticity and inauthenticity as markers of health and illness, respectively. And to me, that's very much reminiscent of Freud's distinction between whatever the opposite of repression is and repression. And the problem is, I think to some degree, both of those groups of thinkers were sort of mealy-mouthed about the real issue. Because Freudian repression is actually something like deception. It's something like a lie. And, Freud didn't use words that bald because they're so contaminated, in a sense, with ethical judgment. But repression is, at minimum, the attempt to not be conscious about something you could be conscious about. And it might interest you to know that under English common law, that's a crime. So if you're a CEO, for example, and you suspect that your chief financial officer might be cooking the books, so that bothers you, affectively, but you decide, well, as long as I don't look at the damn books, that won't be a problem. You're criminally liable for that if you get exposed, because the English common law system presumes that you have an ethical obligation to be conscious of the things that you do that aren't appropriate, that you could be conscious of. So in Freud's repression, to some degree there's ethical discussion about it. That happens more particularly in Jung. But the ethical aspect of it is distinctly underplayed. And you see the same thing with the existentialist authenticity versus inauthenticity. Let's make it stark. One is a form of lying and the other isn't. It's as simple as that. And lying really makes a big difference to people, and it's really underdiagnosed as a cause of psychiatric disorder. You see things of a certain size quite easily because they're handy, right? So objects manifest themselves to you as things because they have some relationship to your capacity to use them as tools, and that's dependent on your size. You have a certain strength and not a different strength. You have a certain degree of articulation. There's some things you can represent in language. So you have limitations that screen out from your consideration all sorts of things. And that's bad because for example, before people discovered germs, there was a lot of them zipping about killing people, and the fact that we couldn't see them wasn't such a good thing. But by the same token, we're also not as overwhelmed with complexity as we might be if we could detect everything. And you know, one of the problems with being connected so much is that it's easy to drown in information, and that's rough for information foragers. You can't stay off your damn computer because there's, you know, it opens up your senses far beyond their normal limitations. And so where should you stop? Well, you don't. You know, you're on the damn thing like a pensioner on a slot machine, and for many of the same reasons. So your body also filters out the world for you and provides you with access to some information and not access to others. And then the same thing is the case with your nervous system. And I put the first picture there of this is the central nervous system that controls voluntary movement, for example. I put it there because people like to think that their brain is in their head, but it's a stupid way of thinking about it as far as I'm concerned, because you have an awful lot of neurological tissue distributed through your body. And like your autonomic nervous system, if I remember correctly, which is mostly distributed through your body, has more neurons in it than your central nervous system. And so you aren't a brain in a body. You know, your brain is really distributed through your whole body. And I think the idea that you have a brain in a body is kind of a holdover from the idea that you have a soul in a body. And not that I'm necessarily criticizing that idea, but I think they kind of got grafted onto one another. And so, but the problem with that is that and this is that, so it's the soul body, brain body, mind body dichotomy, which I think is the same dichotomy. And the problem with that is that it's easy to think of thought as something that's abstracted away from the body. And I think that was an Enlightenment idea, you know, that just like the soul shouldn't be contaminated by the demands of the body if you were going to be pure spiritually, so your thought shouldn't be contaminated by your subjectivity and your emotions and your motivations and all of that. Your abstractions should be independent of your subjectivity. And rationality and emotion are construed in that manner as enemies. You know, that the purpose of rationality is to dispense with the irrationality of emotion and motivation. And that's Freud's idea of the properly functioning ego is something like that too, because the id is this place of compulsion and drive, and the ego has to basically suppress that in the service of the superego. There's no idea of integration really in Freud. Now, I don't want to be rough on Freud, and I think part of the reason that he thought that way is because the patients he had were precisely those who weren't very well integrated because of their pathological past, and so they didn't know how to get those subsystems up into the overarching game, and so their only alternative was something like suppression or repression. Because if you don't know how to be aggressive in a sophisticated way, you're still going to be aggressive, but you're going to have to inhibit it, control yourself, because you can't just be aggressive around people. It just won't go well for you. So even if you can't do it in a sophisticated way, you're going to repress it, or you're going to get in trouble. Those are the options. So, okay, but if you start thinking about the brain, the nervous system as part of the body, as an inseparable part, well then the function of thinking starts to become something different. It's not so much the objective abstract representation of the world, which is kind of what you're pursuing if you're a scientist. It's more like conceptualization of and practice of the proper way of being in the world. And I think that's what you're more interested in anyways. I don't see how you can't be, since you're a living thing, and you're overwhelmingly motivated to successfully manifest those actions that a living thing has to manifest in order to continue. And it's complicated. Like, you can boil it down to survival and reproduction. It's a good overarching simplification, but there's nothing simple about survival and reproduction. I mean, all sorts of complex monsters emerge out of that. even simple conceptualization. But it's not unreasonable to assume that one of the things that people generally want to do is to continue living in as pain-free manner as possible. It's something like that, although that's a simplification. So now the reason I'm making that case is because the fact that you have a body and yet the fact that you have a nervous system is another set of limitations on how it is that you're going to interact with the world. Okay, so now we've got the nervous system. We can go to higher resolution. We say, well, you have a brain. And the brain, let's see if I can, so that's the prefrontal, that's the frontal cortex there. And that's the temporal cortex there, and that's the parietal cortex there, and that's the sensory cortex there. And these were, if I remember properly, these were divisions that I think were first, well, they were first thought through in the late 19th and early 20th century. They're slightly specialized. So this cortex back here does a lot of the elaboration of vision, and that one there helps you with your sense of embodiment and your knowledge about where your body actually happens to be localized. And then that one helps for example in some elements of language output. And then the frontal cortex, especially the prefrontal part, which is up here, is concerned with the organization and the organization of motor action. And that's a good way of thinking about it. You've got part of your brain that deals with the sensory world and in the integration of the sensory world, which seems to happen about there where these places meet. And the prefrontal cortex, it grew out of the motor cortex. The motor cortex helps you plan out voluntary actions. The prefrontal cortex grew out of that in the course of evolution. So you might think, well, there's reflex actions, and they happen when something happens to you, you respond. And then that elaborates up into the motor system, and that enables you to act voluntarily in the world. And then that elaborates up into the prefrontal motor system, which helps you plan how you might act in the world. Right? So it's the prefrontal cortex that's the home of, let's call it complex, sophisticated, voluntary thought, which you could think about as a way of representing the world, but which is more accurately a way of generating avatars of yourself in hypothetical worlds to figure out how they would survive if you did implement them into action. And so I think that's why, so one of the weird things that you discover psychometrically is that there's no correlation between conscientiousness and intelligence. And that's a weird one, you know, because people think about intelligence as planning and forward thinking and all of that, but that's also how they think about conscientiousness, as planful behavior and the consideration of future possibilities. But intelligence and conscientiousness have zero correlation. And so you think, well, why is that? Well, I guess it has to be that way because you couldn't think abstractly if you were prone to act out what you thought. You just go and act it out. And that, like, I mentioned this to you before, when you dream, you're paralyzed. And you can take that little part of the brain that produces that paralysis out of a cat, or out of a person, but we haven't done it with people, out of a cat. And then when the cat falls asleep and hits REM sleep, it'll run around until it runs into something and then it'll wake up. Well, so the dream thinking is so tightly allied with action that there's no separation between them. So there's no real abstraction there. If you couldn't abstract, you wouldn't be able to think. And the fact that you can abstract means that you can separate your thinking from your action. So that's why, as far as I can tell, there's very little correlation between conscientiousness and intelligence. It's like it has to be that way. Because you have to be able to think about things that you wouldn't do if you're going to think. So, and generally we think of people who act as soon as they think as impulsive. So, okay, well, so there's a huge part of the brain that's devoted to sensory processing, and there's a huge part of the brain that's devoted to planning, and the whole prefrontal part of the brain is devoted to planning. And again, so what that indicates is that in large part, as far as your evolved body is concerned, the reason is that you think is so that you can act better. And of course that makes sense. And you can think about memory from that perspective too, because if you think scientifically, you think that your memory of the world is something like an objective record of events, but it's really not very much like that at all. And besides, who cares? You don't need an accurate representation of all the facts about this room. In fact, all it would do is weigh you down. Who cares what color the walls are, or what color the ceiling is, or what color the paint is? All of that's not worth remembering, partly because it has no relationship whatsoever to what you need to do in order to continue to act. And so what you're doing when you remember, as far as I can tell, is that you're mining your experience for information that you can bring forward into the future. It's purely pragmatic. By noon, the dragon filled the house. Its head hung out the front door. Its tail hung out the back door. And there wasn't a room in the house that didn't have some part of the dragon in it. I bet that there is a house like that on, some of you will live, you know, where there's a lot of houses. Some of you live in apartments. Doesn't really matter. But I bet you if you live in a house, on a block of houses, there's at least one house on that street where the tail of the dragon has started to come out of the house. And you know what that's like, eh? Because it's the house that you don't really want to look at when you walk by. You know, and maybe, I don't know, that needs a new roof, and like the door's a little bit crooked, and the lawn isn't cut, and you know, there's some rusty things lying around there, and like it's just not taken care of. And you know, and maybe you know from the gossip in the neighborhood too, that there's something going on in that house that is just not good. And it's got to the point where it's so not good that it's starting to spread itself out beyond the domestic confines of the house. So, you know, you run into people like that now and then too. You'll notice this. So, you know, sometimes, I don't know if this has happened to any of you, but it might have, it's happened to you in some ways. You know that there are those people who can't not tell you everything about what's going on in their life, even if you've hardly even met them. If you see someone who's really in trouble, you know, you'll sit on the bus and somebody who's clearly on the road to being thoroughly deranged will sit down beside you and they'll start telling you about the problems of their life. It's like, you know that the dragon that they're dealing with is so big that they can't even contain it. They're so desperate to have it dealt with that they can't not talk about it. You know, and there's lots of people like that. And they're the ones, what is that stupid little phrase? TMI, is that right? Too much information? It's like, yeah, well, why does that happen? It's because people are dealing with anomalies and unexpected occurrences and tragedies, and they cannot articulate a solution. And most people think by talking, which is also part of the reason that therapy works. It's right, well, do you think? I doubt it. You might, but very few people think. You know, and so if you want to solve a problem, you want to talk it over with a friend. And so, you know, you might just think that you're talking about the problem. Sort of, you know what the problem is, but you're talking about it. So you don't. When you talk about it, you articulate the problem space. You start to generate potential hypotheses about solutions. But more than that, if you're talking to someone, you can watch them just like the little kid with the mouse would watch the mother. It's like, well, here's what I think the problem is. And if you go, you know, you're listening and you go like that, you roll your eyes, you know, it's a hint to the person that maybe that's not the most appropriate way to formulate the problem. Now, maybe you don't roll your eyes, but, you know, you don't encourage them. Or maybe they tell you what the problem is and you're really actively engaged and you're nodding. Well, then they know that maybe they formulated it the way someone half sane and tolerable would formulate it. And then they can walk through the solution. So when you sit down beside someone and they have to tell you everything, one of the things that you know is that they don't have anyone to listen to them. And part of what happens in therapy, and a huge part of it, is that you just listen. I have one client, that's all I ever do with her. She comes in once every 2 weeks, and I just sit there and listen to her for an hour. And now I can maybe have a bit of a discussion with her for the last 10 minutes. But if I try to say anything for the first 50 minutes, she just looks kind of irritated, and, you know, it's like I've interrupted the flow of the interaction. And she's alone. She doesn't have anybody to talk to. So, you know, she wants to listen to herself think, and she can't do that by herself. She has to have someone to do it with. And so, you know, people think by talking, and some people have no one to talk to, and so their problems start to spill out. And, you know, by that time you can't even help them usually, because if you listen for 3 years, it wouldn't be enough listening. You just listen forever and you never get to the bottom of it.